Dear family, what if the person who betrayed you was the one you loved the most? Betrayal is a wound that cuts the deepest when it comes from someone you trust, someone who was supposed to protect you. Have you ever been in a moment where the world around you shattered because of someone you once held dear? Share your story in the comments below. Today, we bring you a tale of deception, resilience, and justice, one that will stay with you long after it ends. If you love stories that touch the soul, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's begin. The wind howled through the trees, slicing through the night like an unseen predator. The air was bitter, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sharp metallic tang of the river. Below, the black water churned, restless under the pale glow of the moon. It was the kind of night where silence carried weight, where the space between words could drown a man. James Carter stood at the river's edge, his boots sinking slightly into the frozen mud. His breath curled in the cold air, slow and steady, but his hands betrayed him. They trembled as they gripped his son's shoulders. Tommy shivered beneath his father's grasp, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something unspoken. A feeling that gnawed at the edges of his mind, whispering of danger before his heart could catch up. "Dad, why are we here?" His voice was small, uncertain. James's jaw tightened, his gaze locked on the dark water. He hadn't meant to hesitate. He hadn't meant for this to be hard. This was supposed to be easy. It was supposed to be necessary. The lawyer had told him it was the only way. If the boy is gone, everything is yours. No court battles, no waiting, no more restrictions keeping him from the life he had worked so hard to claim. And then there was Veronica. "You're hesitating, James. That's why you'll never be more than a broken man clinging to what's left of a dead woman's fortune." She had said it with a smirk, swirling her wineglass in her hand, as if they were discussing a minor inconvenience rather than a decision that would change everything. "He's not your future, James. He's your past, and if you don't cut ties now, you never will." James had told himself she was right, but now standing here, looking at his son, the boy who had Rebecca's eyes and that same quiet strength, something inside him wavered. Tommy's eyes searched his father's face, desperate for reassurance. And for one fleeting moment, James almost gave it to him. Almost. A memory pressed against the cold. 7 years ago. The house had been warm, filled with the scent of birthday cake and the scratchy hum of Rebecca's old radio playing country songs in the background. James had forgotten. Hadn't even realized what day it was until he walked through the door and saw Tommy waiting for him, a hand-drawn card clutched in his small fingers. "I made this for you, Dad." James had frowned, barely glancing at it. "You're the best, Dad." The words were wobbly, scrawled in bright crayon, surrounded by tiny stars. He had mumbled something. "Yeah, kid, thanks," then tossed it onto the counter and walked away. That night, Rebecca had picked it up, smoothing the bent corners with quiet care. She hadn't scolded him. She hadn't even spoken. She had just given him a look, one filled with disappointment deeper than words. And now, all these years later, Tommy was looking at him the same way. James swallowed hard, something foreign clawing at his chest. This wasn't just about money. This was about not being powerless. He saw his own past in flashes. His father, hunched over a kitchen table covered in unpaid bills, the stench of cheap liquor. The muttered words, "I tried, son. I really did." James had sworn that would never be him. He had clawed his way out of that life, built himself into someone who never had to beg, never had to feel weak. He had spent his whole life running from that version of himself. But now his future was standing in front of him, wrapped in the form of a boy who had never asked for any of this. For a single fleeting moment, James considered another path, a different choice. He could let go. He could grab Tommy, pull him close, whisper, "Forget this. Let's go home." He could walk away from the weight of the past, from Veronica's voice in his head, from the lie he had told himself that this was the only way. His hands loosened, his grip slackened. Tommy took a step back, sensing the shift, hope flickering in his eyes. And then, "He's just a problem, James." You know what to do. Veronica's voice curling like smoke in the back of his mind. The hesitation vanished. James's grip tightened once more. His fingers dug into Tommy's jacket, firm, unyielding, his jaw locked. The boy's expression shifted, confusion twisting into something else. "Dad?" James exhaled, a long final breath, and then he shoved his son into the river. The water swallowed Tommy whole, the splash echoing into the stillness. For a moment, James stood frozen, his pulse thundering in his ears. The ripples spread outward, distorting the moon's reflection in broken, shifting patterns. His hands, still outstretched, trembled at his sides. It was done, wasn't it? But as the night stretched on and the wind howled through the trees, James couldn't shake a single terrible thought. Was this truly the end, or just the beginning? The church bells tolled, their solemn chimes rolling through the crisp morning air like a mournful echo of the grief that hung thick in the sanctuary. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of lilies, Rebecca's favorite flowers, arranged in careful, cascading bundles around the dark mahogany casket. Their sweet fragrance mingled with the faint, lingering scent of candle wax and polished wood, filling the room with an almost suffocating stillness. Tommy stood at the front of the church, his small hands gripping the edge of the casket, his fingers pressing into the smooth wood as if he could anchor himself to it, as if holding on tight enough would bring his mother back. His breath came in short, uneven bursts, his throat raw from the sobs that had stolen his voice. "Mom, please wake up." His whisper barely made a sound, but to him it felt like a scream inside his head. The room was filled with quiet weeping, with the soft rustle of tissues and the occasional sniffle. Family members, old friends, and neighbors sat in neat, rigid rows, their faces drawn, their gazes darting cautiously between the grieving boy and the man standing behind him. James Carter stood motionless, hands folded in front of him, his face an unreadable mask. His suit was perfectly pressed, his tie knotted with precision, every detail of his appearance immaculate, as if the presentation of his grief mattered more than the grief itself. He watched the scene before him with a stillness that unnerved those around him. A whisper slithered through the pews. "Doesn't he care at all?" James heard it. He heard them all. The murmurs, the stolen glances, the quiet judgment in the eyes of people who had known Rebecca far longer than they had ever tried to know him. He should have cared what they thought. He should have cared that they saw him as cold, unfeeling. But James had spent a lifetime building walls, walls that had protected him from weakness, from attachment, from the pain of loss. He had learned long ago that to survive, you had to control your emotions, to lock them away where they couldn't be used against you. And now they expected him to cry? To break? No. James Carter did not break. He had done his part. He had made the arrangements, chosen the flowers, ensured the service was carried out without flaw. That was enough. His gaze flickered down to Tommy, still gripping the casket, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. James had never seen his son cry like this. Tommy had always been strong-willed, always stubborn like his mother, always the boy who picked himself up when he scraped his knee, who blinked back tears and insisted, "I'm fine." But now he was just a child, lost and clinging to something that could never hold him back. James shifted uncomfortably. There was an ache in his chest, an unfamiliar, unwelcome pressure pressing against the very walls he had spent years reinforcing. He looked away, jaw tightening. "Enough," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Tommy didn't move. James placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, the same way he had the night before, but this time his grip was gentle. "Let's go," he said, voice softer now, almost tired. Tommy hesitated, his hands tightening around the casket for a brief moment longer, before finally, reluctantly, he let go. The room seemed to exhale with him, the silence shifting, stretching, waiting for something that never came. James turned, leading his son down the aisle. He did not look back. The hum of the fluorescent light overhead was the only sound in the lawyer's office. It flickered slightly, casting a sterile, impersonal glow over the polished mahogany desk and the thick stack of papers spread across its surface. The room smelled of aged leather and ink, a scent James Carter had always associated with power and control. He sat stiffly in the high-backed chair, his posture straight, his fingers laced together on his lap. Everything about him was composed, deliberate. The perfectly pressed suit, the polished shoes, the steady expression that betrayed nothing. He had done everything right. He had handled Rebecca's funeral with precision, had ensured the service ran smoothly, had played the part of the grieving widower just well enough. And now it was time for the final step, the part that actually mattered. Across the desk, Mr. Hamilton adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. The sound was quiet, polite, but something about it sent a ripple of irritation through James. Lawyers were supposed to be efficient, not hesitant. Hamilton glanced at the document in front of him, then at James. "The will of Rebecca Carter," he began, his voice even. "As her legal representative, I am here to carry out her final wishes regarding the distribution of assets." James gave a short nod as if to say, "Let's get on with it." Hamilton continued, flipping to the relevant page. "All assets, bank accounts, properties, investments, are to be transferred to the sole beneficiary." James leaned forward slightly, waiting for the words he had been expecting since the moment Rebecca took her last breath. And then, "All assets go to your son, Tommy." The words landed like a blow to the chest. James's fingers tightened on the arms of the chair, his knuckles going white. For a moment he thought he had misheard, that the words had come out wrong, that this was some kind of mistake. "Excuse me." His voice was calm, measured, but there was something just beneath it, something sharp, dangerous. Hamilton didn't flinch. He simply folded his hands over the document and repeated, "All of Rebecca Carter's assets have been placed in a trust under the sole ownership of her son, Tommy Carter. Upon reaching adulthood, he will have full control over the estate." James felt the room closing in, the walls pressing tighter. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had planned for this moment. He had envisioned it 100 times, signing the documents, taking control, securing everything that should have been his. This wasn't just about the money. It was about not being powerless. He saw his past flash before him, the dim, cluttered apartment where he grew up, his father hunched over at the kitchen table, bills scattered in front of him, the stench of cheap liquor and regret clinging to the air. His father's voice, slurred and pathetic, muttering, "I tried, son. I really did." James had sworn that would never be him. He had clawed his way up from nothing, built himself into someone who never had to beg, who never had to rely on anyone, who never had to hear no. And now his future was in the hands of a child, his own son. A slow, burning rage coiled in his stomach. He forced his voice to remain steady. "And what about me?" Hamilton didn't blink. "You will have access to the estate, but only under one condition." He turned a page, his eyes scanning the legal text. "You are permitted to oversee the assets only if you provide proper care and guardianship for Tommy." James let out a quiet breath, barely noticeable, but inside something had just cracked. So that was the game. Rebecca hadn't just left him out. She had tied him to the very thing he wanted to be free from, his son. He had to play the part of a devoted father, had to pretend to be something he wasn't, someone he had never been, just to access what should have been his. For the first time in years, James Carter felt fear. Not the fleeting kind, not the surface-level discomfort of an inconvenience, but the kind that settled deep in the bones, the kind that whispered of something he couldn't control. He could already hear it now, the lawyer's voice in a year's time, the quiet threat hidden beneath legal jargon. "If you fail to meet the standards of guardianship, the estate will be transferred to a designated trustee. Someone else could take it. Someone else could claim what was his." No, that wouldn't happen. James's grip on the chair loosened, his mind shifting gears. The rage was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but now it was cold, controlled. This wasn't over. He would figure something out. There was always another way. The house was quiet, but not in the way James had hoped. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence that came with control. It was hollow, stretched too thin, like a note played on a broken instrument. The weight of the day sat heavy on his chest, pressing into his ribs as he poured himself a drink. The ice clinked against the glass, sharp and final, as if mocking the moment that should have been his victory. He had walked into the lawyer's office that morning with certainty, with the kind of confidence that came from knowing you had already won. But he hadn't won. The will had shattered everything. All assets go to your son, Tommy. The words had rung in his ears long after he left the office, louder than the sound of his footsteps against the cold marble floors, louder than the chatter of people passing by on the street, louder than the wind that had picked up as he drove home. You'll have access, but only if you care for Tommy properly. James let out a quiet, bitter laugh, rolling the whiskey between his fingers. Rebecca had played her final move well. Even in death, she had found a way to control him. He took a slow sip, letting the burn crawl down his throat, but it did nothing to drown out the frustration pulsing beneath his skin. He wasn't supposed to be trapped like this. For years, he had built his life around one simple truth. Power belonged to those who took it. No one handed it to you. No one gifted it to you out of kindness. You fought for it, clawed your way up, and made damn sure you never had to beg. And now all of it, everything, was out of his hands. He set the glass down harder than he meant to, the sharp sound breaking the stillness. His gaze drifted across the room, landing on his desk. There, among stacks of documents and unread letters, was something small, something he hadn't noticed in years, a folded, faded piece of paper. James stared at it for a long moment before reaching for it. The edges were worn, softened from being handled too many times. Slowly he unfolded it, revealing a child's handwriting, wobbly, uneven, but painstakingly careful. "You're the best, Dad." The crayon letters were surrounded by stars drawn in bright, hopeful colors. He could still remember the way Tommy had beamed when he handed it to him, his little face filled with pride, so sure that his father was someone worth celebrating. James's throat tightened. For a moment, something flickered through him, something he refused to name. He could still hear Rebecca's voice in the back of his mind, the way she had looked at him that night when she found the card discarded on the counter. "He loves you, James. You know that, right?" James had scoffed, brushing her off. "He'll get over it." But now, holding the card in his hands, something inside him cracked, just a little. For a fleeting second, he thought about walking away, thought about leaving it all behind. Veronica, the money, the lawyers, the fight. He thought about waking up tomorrow and pretending none of this had ever happened, about finding a way to be the man Tommy had once believed he was. The second passed. James exhaled sharply. His fingers tightened around the card. And then, without hesitation, he tossed it into the fire. The flames licked at the paper greedily, curling the edges, turning those bright, innocent words into nothing but ash. James watched it burn, his face unreadable, his heart a quiet, steady beat against the weight of his decision. He picked up his phone and dialed. The line rang twice before a voice answered. Calm, composed, cold. "James," the lawyer greeted. James swallowed down the last trace of whiskey and leaned back in his chair. "There has to be another way." His voice was steady, but his grip on the phone was tight. A pause, then, "There is." A beat of silence stretched between them. "But the boy must disappear." James closed his eyes, his grip tightening around the glass in his hand. The fire crackled beside him, casting flickering shadows along the walls, its warmth doing nothing to chase away the cold settling deep in his chest. The house was no longer his home. Tommy stood at the top of the staircase, gripping the wooden banister so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Below him, the living room, the place where his mother used to sit and read, where the soft scent of cinnamon and warm pies once filled the air, had become something unrecognizable. Once his home had been filled with laughter, the soft hum of Rebecca's old country records playing in the background, the warmth of home-cooked meals lingering in every corner. Now it reeked of spilled beer, sweat, and cigar smoke. Loud voices filled the air, overlapping with the pounding bass of music that had no melody, just noise. Strangers filled the space where his mother's presence had once lived. They sat on her couch, leaned against the wall she had painted, drank from glasses she had once carefully set on the table. They laughed too loudly, spilled drinks on the floor, spoke in voices that held no regard for what this house had once been. His chest ached. Tommy's gaze flicked toward the kitchen, hoping, just for a second, to see her there. He could almost picture it. Rebecca moving gracefully between the counters, humming to herself as she pulled a fresh pie from the oven. The scent of apples and cinnamon would wrap around him like a hug, and when she saw him, she'd smile, brushing the flour from her hands before cupping his cheek. "There's my handsome boy," she would say, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. But the kitchen was empty, the oven cold, and his mother gone. A knot tightened in his throat, his breath shaky as he tore his gaze away. And then there was James. His father sat slumped in an armchair, his tie loosened, his whiskey glass half empty, his eyes hollow. He didn't seem to care about the people invading their home, about the noise, about the fact that his son was standing there, barely holding himself together. For a brief, desperate moment, Tommy wanted his father to look up, to see him, really see him, to say something, anything. But James never even glanced in his direction. Across the room, Veronica watched. She lounged on the couch, her bare legs stretched across the cushions, her wine glass cradled in her manicured fingers. She wasn't drinking to enjoy it. She was drinking while waiting. Watching James like a predator watching its prey, waiting for him to fully collapse, for the weight of everything to finally break him. Tommy clenched his jaw. He wanted to scream, to shout, to tell them all to get out, to demand his father do something, anything to stop this. But he knew better. James wouldn't listen. He never had. So instead, Tommy just stood there, watching the last pieces of his life crumble around him. He had already lost his mother, and now he was losing his father too. The party had thinned out. The air inside the house was thick with the remnants of perfume, alcohol, and cigar smoke, swirling together into something suffocating. The laughter had died down, the music had softened to a lazy hum, but the damage had already been done. James sat in his leather armchair, one hand wrapped around a half-empty glass of whiskey, the other resting on the armrest. His tie hung loose around his neck, his shirt wrinkled, his gaze heavy as he stared into the amber liquid, watching the way it caught the dim light. Across from him, Veronica watched. She had been watching him all night, waiting for the moment his resolve would slip, waiting for him to crack. With slow, deliberate movement, she slid onto the arm of his chair, her bare legs folding effortlessly, her manicured nails trailing down his sleeve. "James," she murmured, her voice smooth, coaxing. "Why are you making this so hard?" James didn't move, didn't even glance at her. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, the ice clinking softly. "He's my son," he said, his voice low, almost lost in the haze of the room. Veronica let out a quiet scoff, barely more than a breath, but sharp enough to cut through the air between them. She leaned in closer, her lips near his ear, her tone laced with something colder than the drink in his hand. "No, James," she whispered. "He's Rebecca's son." James's grip on the glass tightened. Veronica tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "And Rebecca never thought you were good enough." Something snapped. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was something quieter, something deadlier. James exhaled slowly, setting his glass down with controlled precision. He turned his head, just slightly, just enough for his eyes to meet Veronica's. The last thread of doubt was gone. He was done hesitating. James stood motionless at the edge of the riverbank, his breath uneven, the wind clawing at his jacket. The splash had long since faded, swallowed by the current, but in his ears it still echoed. The moon's reflection on the water had been shattered by the ripples, breaking into 1,000 flickering pieces. It reminded him of something fragile, something that had once been whole, now lost beneath the surface. His fingers, still curled from where they had gripped Tommy's jacket, twitched slightly. He shoved them into his pockets. It was done. Veronica had been right. The lawyer had been right. So why did it feel like the night was watching him? His chest rose and fell in slow, steady breaths. He told himself this was relief. No more obstacles, no more waiting. But then why was he still standing here? The river was dark and unyielding, offering no answers, no confirmation of finality. For a split second, James wanted to see something, anything, rise from the depths. A struggle, a final cry, even a whisper of movement beneath the water. But there was nothing. The wind howled through the trees, a low, mournful sound. The night stretched on, indifferent. James swallowed, turned on his heel, and walked back toward the car. He didn't look back. The river was merciless. The moment Tommy hit the water, the cold ripped the air from his lungs, sending a shock through his entire body. It was nothing like the gentle waves he had once waded through with his mother, nothing like the playful splashes under the golden summer sun. This was something else, a force that didn't care if he lived or died. He barely had time to scream before the current yanked him under. Darkness swallowed him whole. His arms flailed, his legs kicked wildly, but the weight of his soaked clothes dragged him down. The river wrapped around him like an unrelenting grip, twisting him, pulling him deeper into its depths. This isn't happening. His mind reeled, struggling to process what had just happened. One moment he was looking up at his father, desperate for an answer, for a sign that this wasn't what he thought it was. The next, James had let go. Not by accident, not in fear, deliberately. He threw me in. He wanted me to die. The thought struck like a knife, cutting deeper than the cold. His lungs burned as he fought the urge to inhale, his body screaming for oxygen. He couldn't believe it, wouldn't believe it. This was his father, the man who had once carried him on his shoulders, who had held his hand when he was little, who had kissed the top of his head when he scraped his knee. The man his mother had loved, and yet he had done this. A scream tore through Tommy's chest, but only bubbles escaped, disappearing into the void above. Was he really going to die like this? Forgotten? Swallowed by the river? Then, a voice. No matter how cold it gets, just keep kicking. His mother. The memory was clear, sharper than the pain in his lungs. He saw himself, no older than 6, standing at the edge of this same river, his toes curling over the smooth stones. His mother knelt beside him, her hand warm against his back. "Don't be scared, sweetheart," she had said, smiling. "The water will always feel cold at first, but once you move, once you trust yourself, it can't control you anymore." Tommy clenched his jaw. No, he wasn't going to let the river take him. He wasn't going to let James win. His legs kicked hard, his arms, frozen and sluggish, pushed against the water, dragging him upward. Kicking means you're still alive. His head broke the surface, and he sucked in a ragged gasp of air. The cold bit into his chest, but he was breathing. He coughed violently, his lungs burning, his body shaking, but he forced himself to keep going. The shore. Where was the shore? The moon's reflection rippled ahead, distorted but there. He set his sights on it, forcing his body to move, stroke by stroke, breath by breath. His muscles ached, his fingers numb, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The current pushed back, trying to pull him under again, but he was his mother's son, and she had taught him how to survive. Every stroke felt like an eternity. Every inch forward was a battle. Then his fingers scraped against something solid. Rocks. With the last of his strength, he clawed at the riverbank, his nails breaking against the slick stones as he pulled himself up, his body trembling, his lungs heaving for air. His legs gave out the moment he hit the ground. He collapsed onto the damp earth, coughing up water, shaking so violently he thought his bones might snap. For several long moments, he just lay there, his face pressed against the cold, wet dirt, his breath ragged. His father had tried to kill him. That truth settled into his chest, heavier than the river itself. He had survived the water, but now he had to survive the man who had thrown him in. The morning air was sharp, biting against Tommy's soaked skin as he stumbled away from the river. His limbs were still trembling, his breath still uneven, but his instincts had taken over. Move, find warmth, find food, survive. His clothes, heavy with water, clung to his body like a second layer of ice. He wrapped his arms around himself, rubbing his skin, trying to force some warmth back into his bones. His stomach twisted in hunger, his throat burned from the river water he had swallowed, and his head throbbed with exhaustion. But he kept walking. The sun had barely risen when he reached the outskirts of town. Everything here felt different now. These streets had once been familiar, places where his mother used to take him, where she would wave to neighbors and stop to chat with shopkeepers. But Rebecca was gone, and Tommy wasn't supposed to be here anymore. He reached the first house, a small, run-down place with peeling paint and a rusted mailbox hanging crooked on its post. He raised a weak fist and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked open an inch, just enough for a single tired eye to peer through. "Please." Tommy's voice was hoarse. "Just some food. Anything." The door opened a little more, just enough for Tommy to see a middle-aged man standing there in a stained undershirt. The man's face twisted in irritation. "Not my problem, kid," he muttered, slamming the door shut so hard the frame rattled. Tommy flinched but forced himself to move on. The next house was a little nicer, with flower pots on the porch and lace curtains in the window. Maybe this one would be different. Maybe... Before he could even knock, the door flew open. A woman stood there, her face pinched in disgust. "Go away," she snapped. She didn't let him finish. A bucket of cold water splashed over his head, drenching him all over again. Tommy gasped, stumbling backward, the shock cutting through him like a blade. "Filthy little beggar," the woman spat before slamming the door. The water dripped from his hair, running down his face, his back soaking into his already wet clothes. His fingers clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw locking to keep his teeth from chattering. He wanted to scream, to pound on the door, to demand why wouldn't they help him? But he didn't. Instead, he stood there for a long moment, staring at the sky, at the dull gray clouds drifting overhead. He was supposed to be dead. So why did it feel like the world still wanted him gone? The river had nearly taken his life. Now standing at its edge once more, Tommy felt the weight of that night pressing down on him like an anchor. The water churned lazily, its surface coated with filth. Floating plastic bottles, rusted cans, entangled fishing lines clinging to the banks like scars. The current moved slow, heavy with years of neglect. It didn't look like something that could ever be saved. Neither did he. He should have died here. That thought had haunted him since the moment he crawled onto the shore. Lungs burning, body shaking, heart shattered. He had survived. But for what? His father had cast him aside. The town had turned its back on him. He had no home, no family, no future. He was nothing. But then a voice. Software familiar. Sometimes the best way to fix yourself is to fix something else. His mother. She had said those words once, after Tommy had come home from school with bruises on his arms, humiliated and furious. He had wanted revenge, had wanted to lash out, to make someone else feel the same pain he did. But Rebecca had simply knelt in front of him, her eyes filled with quiet strength. "Build something, Tommy. Make something better than what they tried to take from you." Now standing in the very place where his life should have ended, he understood. Maybe if he could restore the river, if he could bring life back to something so broken, so forgotten, he could find a way to restore himself too. His hands clenched into fists. He bent down, reaching into the murky water, his fingers closing around the first piece of garbage. A shattered glass bottle. Tommy pulled it free, tossing it onto the bank. Then another, and another. The cold bit at his skin. The mud sucked at his shoes, but he didn't stop. He worked until his arms ached, until his fingers bled, until the weight inside him felt just a little lighter. But the world had not changed. Not yet. By the third day, people had begun to notice. They stood at a distance, watching with amused curiosity as the boy no one wanted waded into the filth, dragging out old tires and broken furniture. The laughter came soon after. "That water's been dirty for decades," an old man scoffed, shaking his head. "You think you can fix it?" A woman passing by chuckled under her breath. "Poor kid's lost his mind." Even the children mocked him, kicking at the piles of garbage he had pulled from the water. Tommy said nothing. He kept working, day after day, with every rusted can he tossed aside, with every tangled net he untied from the rocks. Something inside him grew stronger, because he wasn't just cleaning the river, he was proving that he was still here. The river was beginning to change. It had taken weeks of backbreaking work, of pulling out rusted cans, tangled fishing nets, and scraps of forgotten lives. His hands were raw, his arms ached, but the water was clearing. It was slow, painfully slow, but for the first time in years, the current was moving freely again. Still, the town watched him with skepticism. Some laughed, some shook their heads, but others had started to pay attention. It didn't matter. Tommy wasn't doing this for them. He was doing it for himself. He waded deeper into the river, the cold seeping into his bones. He had been working since sunrise, his body weighed down with exhaustion, but something caught his eye, a glint beneath the water, something that didn't belong. Curious, he reached down, his fingers searching through the silt and smooth stones. Then, metal. He gripped it, pulling hard, feeling the weight of something long buried. The mud resisted, but Tommy refused to let go. With one last yank, the object broke free, sending a ripple through the water. An old rusted box. Tommy's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he hauled it onto the shore. It was heavy, its edges corroded with time, the metal stained from years beneath the water. His heart pounded as he pried it open. Inside, beneath a layer of damp cloth, were three things: a letter, a set of blueprints, and a check. Tommy's hands trembled as he pulled the paper free, his eyes widening as he read the number printed across it. $5 million. The air around him seemed to still. He unfolded the letter with careful fingers. The ink faded but still legible. As he read, the world tilted beneath him. To whoever finds this, I have watched this river decay for years, its beauty stripped away by greed, its purpose forgotten by those who were meant to protect it. But I do not believe it is lost. I do not believe all hope is gone. This land, this river, needs a guardian, someone willing to fight for it, someone worthy. If you bring life back to the river, you inherit the land. Tommy's hands tightened around the paper. His pulse roared in his ears. This wasn't just money. This was a chance to build something, a chance to take back what had been stolen, a chance to prove to himself, to the town, to James, that he wasn't nothing. A twig snapped behind him. Tommy froze. The world around him felt unnervingly still, the river's soft murmur, the distant rustle of leaves. But beneath it all, he could feel it. Someone was watching him. Slowly he turned. A boy, no older than 15, stood at the edge of the trees. His clothes were ragged, his face thin and sharp, his dark eyes locked onto Tommy, not with curiosity, but with something else, something hungry. "That yours?" the boy asked, his voice casual. Too casual. Tommy's grip tightened around the letter. "I found it," he said, taking a small step backward, his heart hammering. The boy smirked. "Yeah." He tilted his head, stepping forward. "Well, now I'm finding it too." Tommy barely had time to react before the boy lunged. Instinct took over. Tommy whirled and ran. Branches whipped against his arms, sharp twigs snagging his clothes, but he didn't dare slow down. The boy was right behind him. Too fast, too determined. "Come on!" the boy shouted, his voice breathless but filled with confidence. "You think you can outrun me?" Tommy didn't answer. He just pushed harder. The weight of the rusted box in his arms slowed him down, but he clutched it tighter. He could hear the boy's footsteps, hear the way they gained ground with every second. He had to lose him. He veered left, cutting through a thicket of trees, his breath ragged. Then, a clearing. An old wooden bridge stretched over a narrow creek, its planks rotted and warped from years of rain and neglect. It wasn't sturdy, but it was his only chance. Tommy didn't hesitate. He leapt onto the bridge, his feet barely making contact with the slick wood before pushing off again. The structure groaned beneath him, shifting dangerously. Behind him, the other boy hesitated for just a second, just long enough. The moment Tommy's feet hit solid ground on the other side, he threw his weight against the closest wooden beam. The bridge, already weak, gave way with a splintering crack. Wood snapped, ropes frayed, and half of the bridge collapsed into the creek below. Tommy stumbled back, gasping, watching as the boy skidded to a stop just before the broken edge. For a second, neither of them moved. Then the boy cursed under his breath, his dark eyes locking onto Tommy with something between frustration and reluctant admiration. "This isn't over," he muttered. Tommy didn't wait to find out if that was true. He turned and ran. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of town. Only when the glow of streetlights came into view did he allow himself to slow down. His legs felt like lead, his lungs burning with every breath. But he had won, at least for now. He clutched the rusted box closer to his chest and looked down at the letter inside. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. "For legal matters, contact Callaway and Associates, 142 West Elm Street." A law office. Tommy wiped the sweat from his brow, steadied his breath, and set off toward the address. Whatever this box meant, whatever this letter was promising, he needed answers. Tommy walked through the city streets, clutching the rusted box like a lifeline. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and wet pavement, the hum of traffic filling the space around him. Towering buildings loomed on either side, casting long shadows beneath the fading afternoon light. It was a world away from the river, from the filth, from the silence. People stared as he passed. A woman wrinkled her nose, stepping aside to avoid him. A man glanced up from his newspaper, his gaze flicking over Tommy's mud-streaked clothes before looking away. To them, he was just another lost kid, another problem to ignore. But Tommy didn't care. He kept walking, his legs aching, his feet blistered from the miles he had traveled. He had fought too hard to stop now. At last, he reached his destination, a modest law office nestled between a bank and an old bookstore. Callaway and Associates. Tommy exhaled sharply, gripping the box tighter. Then he stepped inside. The law office smelled of old books and polished wood, the air thick with the weight of conversations that had shaped people's fates for decades. Tommy stood in front of the massive desk, his clothes stained with dirt, his face still streaked from dried river water and exhaustion. Across from him, Mr. Callaway watched him with quiet skepticism. The older man adjusted his glasses, his sharp eyes scanning Tommy's appearance. He was used to dealing with high-profile clients, men in tailored suits with firm handshakes, not a half-starved boy clutching a rusted metal box. "Son, do you have an appointment?" Callaway asked, his voice even but distant. Tommy shook his head, his fingers curled around the box in his arms as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "No, but I found this," he said, setting the box on the desk with a heavy thud. "By the river." Callaway barely glanced at it. "The river?" "Yes," Tommy insisted, his voice steady despite the nervous knot forming in his chest. "Your name was in the letter inside. It said to come here." At that, Callaway's expression flickered with mild curiosity. But it was still clear. He didn't believe him. Tommy swallowed hard and carefully pried open the box. Inside, the yellowed letter sat atop the blueprints and the check, its edges worn from time. Callaway reached for it, unfolding it with deliberate care. His eyes swept over the words, his brow furrowing. The room fell into absolute silence as he read. Then, he froze. His posture stiffened, his breath caught, and for the first time, there was something else in his expression. Recognition. Tommy saw the moment everything clicked into place. The old lawyer sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He looked up at Tommy, this time not with doubt, but with something heavier. "Where did you say you found this?" Callaway asked, his voice quieter now. "In the river," Tommy said. "I've been cleaning it. That's how I found the box." Callaway nodded, more to himself than to Tommy, as if pieces of an old puzzle were finally falling into place. "You did what no one else had the courage to do," the lawyer murmured. His fingers tapped against the paper, deep in thought. Then finally he lifted his gaze and spoke the words that changed everything. "This document is legally binding," Callaway said, "which means, as of this moment, the river and all surrounding land belong to you." Tommy's breath hitched. He had come here looking for answers. Instead, he had found something bigger than he ever imagined. The river had been reborn. What was once a wasteland of filth and decay had become something almost unrecognizable. The waters ran clear, reflecting the sky in shades of deep blue and gold. Trees lined the banks, their leaves whispering in the wind, their roots drinking from the very earth that had once been poison. Life had returned. Birds swooped low over the surface. Fish darted through the current, and the air no longer carried the stench of rot, but the crisp, clean scent of flowing water. And at the heart of it all stood the estate. Tommy had built it with his own hands, not alone, but with a team that believed in what he was trying to do. A grand lodge stood where the land had once been abandoned, surrounded by cabins and gardens, winding paths leading down to the river's edge. It was a place for people to come, to rest, to heal. The same villagers who had once laughed at him now watched in silence. Some had mocked him. Others had turned him away when he was starving, shivering on their doorsteps. Now, as the estate took shape, they found themselves on the other side of the struggle. The land they had lived on for years, the land they had let fall into ruin, was no longer theirs. Some left with their heads held high. Others grumbled under their breath, calling him heartless, cruel, ungrateful. Tommy tried to ignore their words, but they followed him, whispering in the back of his mind. Had he done the right thing? He told himself they had never cared about the river. They had watched it die and done nothing. They had let it drown in filth, the same way they had let him drown when he was just a boy begging for help. And yet, as he stood on the balcony of the estate, looking out at the land he had reclaimed, he felt something uneasy settle in his chest. His mother would have wanted him to save the river, that much he knew. But would she have wanted him to push people out? The wind carried the sound of the water below, steady and constant. The river did not hold grudges. It did not care who had hurt it, who had abandoned it, who had fought for it. It only knew how to keep moving forward. Tommy exhaled slowly. He had spent his whole life fighting to survive, fighting to prove that he was more than what his father had left behind. But now, for the first time, he had the power to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. And that decision, the one that would define him, was still ahead. The past had a way of catching up. For years, Tommy had lived in the shadow of his father's betrayal. He had carried the weight of that night, the cold river, the helplessness, the moment he realized he had been thrown away like he meant nothing. But he had survived, and now standing outside the office building, he was no longer that terrified boy. The sign above the entrance read Carter and Company, but it no longer belonged to James. Tommy had made sure of that. His father's wealth had withered away, bled dry by bad investments and reckless spending. He had lost the estate, the money, the power. All that remained was this, an aging office in a crumbling building. Tommy stepped inside. The receptionist barely glanced up, uninterested in the young man striding past her. He didn't need directions. He knew exactly where to go. James's office was at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. Tommy paused for only a moment before pushing it open. Inside, his father sat behind a desk that was too big for him now, surrounded by stacks of unpaid bills. The once proud man who had thrown his own son into a river was nothing more than a shell of what he had been. James looked up, irritated at the interruption. Then he saw Tommy. The color drained from his face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. James gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white. His eyes darted to the door as if calculating his escape. But there was nowhere left to run. Tommy took a step forward. "Dad," he said, his voice steady. "It's me." James opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Tommy like he was seeing a ghost. "You..." His voice was barely above a whisper. Tommy let the silence stretch, watching as the realization sank in. James had thought he was dead. James had built his life on that assumption, spending every cent of Rebecca's inheritance, burying the past beneath piles of money and distractions. But now the past was standing right in front of him. "You should have known," Tommy said quietly. "I wasn't going to disappear that easily." James swallowed hard. His hands trembled as he reached for the whiskey glass on his desk. Tommy didn't stop him. Let him drink. Let him numb the truth. James took a shaky sip, then set the glass down with a dull clink. He forced a smirk, though his eyes were still wide with fear. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "You came all this way for what? Revenge?" Tommy exhaled slowly. "I came for justice." As if on cue, a knock sounded at the door. James barely had time to react before the door swung open. Two uniformed officers stepped inside. James shot up from his chair, his face twisting in rage. "What the hell is this?" he snapped. One officer stepped forward. "James Carter, you are under arrest for attempted murder." James's breath came fast and uneven. He turned to Tommy, his face contorted with something between fury and desperation. "You!" His voice trembled with rage. "You stole my life. Everything should have been mine." But Tommy was already stepping back, watching as the officers cuffed his father's wrists. James struggled, his voice rising. "This is a mistake. You can't do this to me. His words died in his throat as he locked eyes with Tommy one last time. There was no anger in Tommy's face, no triumph. Just the quiet certainty of someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side. The past had caught up at last, and justice had finally been served. Months later, the courtroom was filled with hushed whispers as the judge delivered the final verdict. "James Carter," the judge's voice rang clear, "you have been found guilty of attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, and the unlawful misappropriation of assets. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison." A murmur rippled through the crowd. James sat motionless, his hands clenched into fists, his face pale. Tommy remained in the back of the courtroom, watching. There was no triumph in his expression, just quiet finality. Justice had finally been served, and with the ruling, the estate, the business, and all that James had once stolen were legally restored to Tommy. The inheritance meant for Rebecca's family was back in the hands of the son she had fought so hard to protect. But for Tommy, it was never about the money. It was about proving that the past did not own him. He walked out of the courthouse, taking in a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. For the first time in years, the weight was gone. The river was waiting, and he was finally free to go home. The river had once been a place of sorrow. Now, it was a place of second chances. Tommy stood on the porch of his home, overlooking the land he had fought so hard to reclaim. The once polluted waters now ran clear, the banks alive with the rustling of leaves and the laughter of children playing nearby. The estate had become more than just a monument to his survival. It was a promise, a place where things could be rebuilt, where wounds could heal. Behind him, Emily stepped out onto the porch, brushing flour from her hands. "You're thinking about them again, aren't you?" she asked gently. Tommy exhaled, glancing toward the village beyond the trees. The same people who had once turned him away, who had slammed their doors in his face, mocked his efforts and treated him like he was nothing, now found themselves at his mercy. The land belonged to him. He could have forced them out, let them taste the helplessness he had once felt. But what would that prove? His father had believed that power was about control, about taking. Tommy had learned that real strength came from giving. He had made his decision months ago. The villagers could stay, but on new terms. Instead of being pushed out, they were offered work. The same hands that had once let the river rot now tended to its waters. They helped clean the land, planted trees along the banks, maintained the gardens that lined the estate. The people who had once mocked him were now part of something bigger, something that would last. There had been grumbling at first. Some had resisted the idea, unwilling to accept that the boy they had dismissed now held the power to change their fate. But time had softened them. One by one, they came to understand. They weren't just preserving the river for Tommy. They were preserving it for themselves. Emily stepped beside him, slipping her arm around his. "Your mother would be proud." Tommy smiled, his gaze drifting back to the water. "I hope so." A child's voice broke through his thoughts. "Dad, look what I found." Tommy turned to see his son standing by the river, holding a smooth stone in his small hands. His face was lit with excitement, his hair wild from the wind. Tommy walked over, crouching beside him. "Let me see." The boy placed the stone in his father's palm. "Mom says this means the water is healthy, that it's alive." Tommy ran his fingers over the cool surface, nodding. "She's right." The boy grinned before running off to join his siblings, their laughter blending with the soft rush of the river. Tommy lingered, watching the water move. Once it had nearly taken everything from him. Now it was everything. A reminder that pain could be transformed into purpose, that the past didn't have to define the future, that even the most broken things could be restored. The river would always flow, and so would he. The past has a way of shaping us, but it does not have to define us. Tommy's journey was never just about survival. It was about transformation. He was thrown away, left for dead by the very person who was supposed to love him most. He had every reason to let bitterness consume him, to let his pain turn to hate, to become the very thing he had suffered under. But instead, he chose something else. He chose to fight, not with revenge, but with purpose. He took what was broken and made it whole again. He turned pain into power, not by tearing others down, but by building something greater than himself. Isn't that what true strength is? We all face betrayals. We all have moments when the world tells us we are nothing, that our fight is pointless, that we should just give up. But Tommy's story reminds us that we are more than the things that happen to us, that even in the face of loss, of injustice, we still have a choice. Do we let our past destroy us, or do we use it to build something greater? Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever fought for something when everyone told you it was impossible? Have you ever turned pain into purpose? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if Tommy's journey moved you, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because sometimes all it takes is one moment, one decision to change everything. Thank you for being part of this community. Until next time, keep fighting for what matters.